Chapter 684. It's been a while. 4. I assumed that without the system interface, it would be difficult to understand how skills worked. But that wasn't the case. The moment I absorbed the bone, I instinctively knew both the name of the skill and what it could do. In fact, I could even argue it made things easier for me. Letting out another breath, and staring at my own reflection, or to be more precise, my eyes, I had a couple of mixed feelings. I was quite familiar with the skill. Having been subjected to it, I knew just how terrifying it was. However, at the same time, it wasn't exactly the same as when Zahirl used it on me. If I'm not mistaken, the skill should allow me to erase the existence of anyone whom I look at. Not just other people, but I can do it to myself too. For as long as my mana could keep up, I could erase my own existence and the existence of anyone that I targeted. This was all that I mainly knew about the skill. In order to figure out more, I needed to do a little bit of experimenting. I'm sure that given my current strength, the skill isn't as powerful as when Zahirl used it. For instance, Zahirl had the power to nearly wipe my existence from reality itself. I didn't know the full extent of the effect, but I was certain that within the mirror dimension at least, I was slowly being forgotten, piece by piece, from everyone's memory. I wasn't capable of doing the same thing. But at the same time, I had an inkling that the reason why Zahirl was capable of pulling such a feat wasn't only because of its strength. There was certainly something else that granted it such power. If I had to take a guess, most likely, I can affect a certain range. Maybe the entire city. I wasn't entirely sure. I would need to do a little testing in order to figure that out. The other things that I needed to figure out with this new skill were the mana consumption. I'm sure it will consume more mana depending on the number of people that I use the skill on and their general strength level. Even more testing was necessary in order for me to figure that out. However, in general, I understood the principles of the skill and the ways that I could utilize it. If used properly, this skill was extremely powerful. If I could erase my existence as I willed it, alongside another person, then I could isolate myself alongside the person that I targeted, creating a lot of confusion. It could turn situations where I was ambushed by multiple enemies into one-on-one situations. I can even potentially make it so that they forget that they're targeting me. Against weaker opponents, I felt that this could work. The issue was the stronger ones. I didn't feel like I'd be able to keep the skill for long with them. However, it could certainly buy me some time and an opening. At the very least, a situation like back when I was attacked by the Church of Oricleus wouldn't occur. All in all, this was an extremely powerful skill, befitting that of a primordial ranked bone. Taking a deep breath, I closed my eyes, opening them up again to see that both my pupils had returned to the same hazel color that I was used to. My face also started to change slightly, deforming from my original appearance. I quickly stopped that by channeling my mana. I couldn't go back to my original appearance just yet. On a different note, I feel that my mana has increased quite a bit after absorbing the bone. I shouldn't be too far off from the 7th tier. I felt like it wouldn't take long for me to reach that tier. Thinking about it, my current rate of progress was astounding. Normally, from the 6th tier and up, it would take several years for one to reach the next tier. As far as I was aware, it took Delia a couple of years in order for her to reach the 7th tier. While it's true that she started later than others because of how stubborn she was, it still doesn't change that I'm growing at a speed that is unheard of. I had some mixed feelings about this. I was happy to some extent, but at the same time, I knew that it was still not fast enough. The current pace at which I was growing was still too slow for me. I previously thought that Cithras would be the end of it all, but that looks to be only half the truth. Outer beings. That was what the goddess called them. I still didn't know much about them, nor what their goal was. However, if there was one thing that was clear to me, it was the fact that they were the main reason behind the mirror dimension. Whatever they wanted, it was certainly not going to be something that I liked. As far as I'm aware, Cithras might be the only one who can fight against them. I need to reach a point where I am at least on par with him in order to even have a chance at fighting against these outer beings. No, that's not enough. I needed to become stronger than Cithras. Develop my emotive magic further, and become the 8th god. Me becoming the 8th god was the key to it all. Yes, I should focus on improving my emotive magic even more. I had just reached the 5th level, but there was still a lot for me to improve on. The 5th level was different from the previous levels. At this level, I could see the emotions of a person through different orbs. However, controlling the orbs mainly depended on one's level of said emotions. My strongest emotions were anger, fear, and sadness. I could manipulate the two emotions without any issues. The issue came with the other emotions. I needed to improve in that aspect. It was only once I mastered all of the basic emotions that I'd be able to truly tap into the next level. The 6th level. Indeed, now that I had reached the 5th level of emotive magic, I was certain about it. There was a level that went beyond the 5th level. The only reason why nobody knew about it, or even talked about it, was that nobody had ever reached that level before. Only those who reached the 5th level of emotive magic would be able to sense it. But even then, it was faint, extremely faint, and, even I felt unsure of how to tap on it. However, if there was one thing that I knew, it was that it existed. That was all I needed. All I needed was that little knowledge in order to keep me driving forward. Still, that was easier said than done. The road was still a long one, and I understood that it wasn't going to come easily. All right, closing my eyes once more and taking another breath in order to recover myself, I opened my eyes again and moved away from the sink, moving back to the room, only for me to stop shortly after. About this, scratching the back of my head, I pursed my lips. Should I make Anaz pay for this? The darkness completely swallowed the room. A single figure sat within the darkness, staring blankly at their hand. It was currently trembling. Following the darkness was a stifling silence. It enveloped the entire room, covering every inch of it as the figure remained still. But soon, a change began to occur. The darkness pulsed, almost as if it were alive. Throb, throb. It pulsed more and more powerfully with each passing second, the surroundings shaking as a result. A terrifying pressure also began to emerge within the room. One that almost seemed to swallow everything in the surroundings. If not for the figure's careful control over their power, the power could have easily overtaken the entire surroundings, flattening everything. Throb. The throbbing persisted, growing even more powerful. The darkness pulsed once again, but this time, as though the darkness was a veil, it started to stretch weirdly. And then, throb. With a sudden, powerful throb, the darkness surged outward before collapsing in on itself, stripping the room bare and revealing a simple space. A bed, a desk, a chair, and a wardrobe. Nothing extravagant, yet the figure seated at the center stood in stark contrast to the plainness around her. Her black hair swayed gently in the still air, and her deep, obsidian eyes seemed to embody the darkness itself. Yet within that shadowed presence was an undeniable beauty, one that no amount of darkness could conceal. A day had passed since the fight with the gigantic monster. Despite Delilah's best attempts at trying to suppress the pain that came after the event, she found herself unable to as some sort of strange and foreign power dug deeply into her body, latching onto her blood and causing it to stir. Delilah spent the entire day trying to figure out what the strange power was. At first, she thought it was the monster's blood. However, Delilah quickly realized that it wasn't the case, as whatever had entered her body was extremely strong and seemed to have a will of its own. Normally, one would be worried about having a foreign substance enter their body. However, for some strange reason, Delilah felt that the substance was somehow connected to her. Rather than trying to harm her, it almost felt as though it was trying to help her. She felt all the injuries that she had incurred, be it in the fight, and in the past, slowly start to heal, alongside her body. At the same time, she also started to feel her heart starting to boil. Almost as if it was growing excited. What could it be? The situation left Delilah completely confused. She wanted to dig deeply into her body to figure out the origin of the weird substance and why it was resonating so much with her. But that was easier said than done. And most importantly, lowering her head to stare at her trembling hand again, Delilah pursed her lips. She could feel it. The wall that she had been struggling to break for the past years, it was finally starting to show cracks. She was one step closer to reaching the next tier. The Zenith. Chapter 685. It's been a while. 5. What? A loud shout cut through the surroundings. You want me to pay for your mess? This is bullshit. I don't have the money. No, more importantly, what in the world did you do to reduce your room into this mess? Coming up into Lazarus's room to check up on him, the last thing Anaz expected was the sight that greeted him. What could he even call the sight that greeted him? A mess, a disaster. It looked like a storm had come. There was practically nothing left of the room. The windows were shattered, all sorts of splinters of wood littered the floor, presumably pieces of what once used to be the furniture and the floor. The walls were dented, and the bed, where the hell was the bed? Glaring at Lazarus, who was tracing his finger across the wall with a stoic expression, Anaz felt like beating him up. Of course, he stopped himself when he recalled just how powerful Lazarus was. "Oh wow," a soft voice echoed shortly after as Anne entered the room, whistling to herself as she saw the mess. Brushing her curly hair back, she placed her hand on her cheek. "I did hear you say that this place was a mess, but can this thing even be called a mess? I'd say, total annihilation, would be a more fitting term." Despite seeing the mess, Anne didn't seem to share the same frustration as Anaz. In fact, she found the situation to be somewhat amusing. Then again, it wasn't like Lazarus had asked her to pay. "Wait, now that I think about it, I can have her pay for the place." Anaz hastily opened his mouth, but quickly felt a hand press against it, stopping whatever word was about to come out. "I'm not paying." "Huh, he didn't even say anything. I don't need to read your mind to know what you're thinking. Your face tells me all that I need to know." Quote ellipsis dot dot quote. Anaz stopped struggling from that moment, his shoulders slumped in the process. Both Lazarus and her were richer than him. Why was he made to be the one paying for Lazarus's mess? It wasn't cheap either. This place was made specifically to withstand the harsh environments of the mirror dimension. The price of the repairs was enough to make Anaz want to throw himself out the window. On another note, what in the world did you do to create a mess like this? Anas's ears perked up the moment he heard Anne's words. He was also curious to know the answer. Just what in the world did the merchant do in order to turn the room like this? "Oh, that." Pulling his hand away from the wall, Lazarus turned his attention towards them. "Not really a secret, I just absorbed Zayahrl's bone." "Oh, I see." As Anne nodded and pulled her hand away from her cheek, Anaz reached his hand forward to grab her hand to cover his mouth. "Huh, you sick perv." Anne suddenly blinked. As though the clogs in her head had suddenly been oiled, she blinked a couple of times before her eyes suddenly widened. "You, This time, it was Anaz who covered her mouth as she nearly shouted at the top of her lungs. "Shish." She proceeded to glare at him, but stopped when she realized how serious the situation was as she pulled her hand away from his mouth. Similarly, pulling his hand away, the two stood in silence for a brief moment before Anaz opened his mouth again, looking at Lazarus as though he were some sort of monster. "You managed to get Zayahrl's bone. How did you?" "I clearly remember that." "That's not important. He probably won't answer even if we ask." Anne cut Anaz off, staring at Lazarus intently. "What skill did you learn?" This was the thing that Anne was most curious about. What sort of skill did a primordial ranked bone give? Surely it wasn't going to be anything bad, right? Both Anaz and Anne looked at Lazarus with anticipation. Feeling their gazes, Lazarus smiled before staring in Anas's direction. The moment he did, his left eye suddenly changed color, and the world froze for a split second. By the time the world returned to normal, both Anaz and Anne blinked their eyes. "Huh, did you do something?" "I don't." However, a few seconds later, both of their expressions changed as they looked at each other. Anne's expression turned extremely serious as she looked at Anaz. The same was true for Anaz, who turned to look at Julian. "Shit, we got an intrid, Uke." Bang. Anaz was never able to finish his sentence before he was suddenly thrown into the wall, his back crashing against it as his face turned pale and he spat out saliva. Thud. Sliding onto the ground, Anne was about to follow up when she stopped, and her expression changed. "Oh, shit," Anaz groaned while he slowly raised his head to look at Lazarus. Memories started to surface in his mind as the two of them looked towards Lazarus, whose expression was rather pale. His eyes were back to their usual color, and his expression eased shortly after. Covering his left eye, which was currently burning intensely, he began to mumble to himself, "In the end, I wasn't able to last long. It seems that trying to pull this on a tier 8 is still too much for me. However, it still works so." Neither Anaz nor Anne was stupid. The two instantly understood the situation as they looked at one another. "He erased our existence. He did that thing." Having lived through this exact scenario before, the two of them immediately understood what Lazarus had just done, and their mouths fell open, unable to mask their shock. This skill, it was extremely overpowered. Looking around, Lazarus sat down on the floor. The mana consumption of the skill was far higher than he had previously expected. But nonetheless, he still found the results to be good. While he couldn't affect the mind of a high-tiered user for long, it was still long enough for him to gain an advantage. But he was still far from satisfied. There were still a couple of things that he wanted to test out. Raising his head to look at the still shocked Anaz and Anne, Lazarus forced a smile as his eyes changed color once more. At the same time, he looked at Anaz with pity. Sorry in advance. Asterisk. Get your bone. Buy a bone. Our bones are of the highest quality. Get your bone. We offer our bones at a lower price than most other bones. Anaz screamed at the top of his lungs, waving a couple of bones in the air. As he screamed, people would turn to look in our direction as they pointed at us. Or more specifically, Anaz, whose face was currently swollen. I looked at him with pity before lowering my head and grabbing a handful for myself. Bones. Get your bones. This was the price of poverty. In order to pay for the room that I had broken, we had no other choice but to sell bones. At first, I thought that Anaz would have some money to help, but he was dirt poor. The same was for Anne, who had to pay for her crew and all the damages that her ship sustained. In fact, she was probably the poorest out of all of us. Get your bones. That was also why she was probably the loudest of the three of us. This is of the highest quality. As I waved another bone in the air, I suddenly felt a tug over my shoulder, and when I looked to my right, I saw Anaz looking at me with a suspicious look. Wait, now that I think about it, do you really have no money? What was he saying? Of course, I didn't have money. Why else would I be doing this? Anas's eyes narrowed. From what I remember, you sold quite a lot of goods, no? Back when you just opened the Grey Chamber of Commerce. Memories started to resurface in my mind. Thinking about it, that did indeed happen. If I'm not wrong, you even sold quite a lot of goods to Silas. There was quite a large deposit involved, was it not? He also didn't take the stuff as far as I remember. My eyes started to widen as I felt Anne suddenly stop, her head slowly turning towards me as I suddenly broke into a cold sweat. I certainly did remember this, yes. I cleared my throat, moving my head a little bit further away from Anaz, who was moving his head dangerously close to me. It's rather dry here, don't you think? I licked my lips. At the same time, I placed the bones in my hand on the table. Dry. Do you think it's dry, Anne? Not much different than how it usually is. Quote. These two. I licked my lips once again, bringing my consciousness into my ring, where I saw several large bags filled with coins. Looking at it, there was probably quite a lot. I brought my consciousness back and looked at the two of them. Holding onto my chest, my lips started to quiver. Don't bring up the matter of the money. Just thinking about it hurts me. Both Anaz and Anne looked taken aback. I bit my lips, mumbling, sadness, over and over again as a certain pain started to invade my chest, causing something to streak down the side of my face. During my fight against Zahirl, I practically lost everything. I did have the money before, but gone, everything is gone. Clutching my shirt, I had to take a moment to sit down. The pain was starting to get to me. I was so immersed in my character that I even started to believe my own story. Oh, my money. I covered my face with both hands, peeking through the gaps just to see Anaz and Anne looking somewhat taken aback and sorry. Seeing them like that, I did feel a little sorry. Unlike Lazarus, I was an award-winning actor. He might not be able to fool them, but me. Any day. If only I didn't. We all paused for a moment. Did you just laugh? He did, didn't he? I did, didn't I? Feeling my heart slowly sink, I was about to put up an even grander act when, all of a sudden, a voice echoed from behind. Is everything all right? I paused the moment I heard the voice. It was a voice I was all too familiar with. One that I had spent a major part of my life in this world with, and one belonging to a man who called himself my knight. I saw that you were selling bones. If now is not a good time, then. Leon. He was right behind me. Chapter 686. It's been a while. 6. A few moments prior. Where do you think the Chancellor is? I can't wait to get out of this place already. How long do we have to remain here? I'm tired. It's hot. In the wake of the battle with the colossal beast and the chaos that followed, the cadets found themselves stranded in the remnant south. Besides the port, the city didn't suffer much damage. Most of the buildings remained intact, and aside from the occasional murmur about what had happened, life went on as usual. The city had returned to the same bustling rhythm it had before the events unfolded. Leon, alongside most of the cadets, had left their own place in order to look around. They were currently all waiting for the Chancellor to come back. She was the only one who could bring them out of this place. Without her, it'd be impossible for them to find their way back. Walking ahead, Evelyn turned around and said, "There's no point in complaining. The Chancellor most likely suffered some injuries from the fight. She's probably taking some time to recover. Injuries. Aoife raised her brow. Do you really think the Chancellor suffered some injuries? She looked okay to me. I mean, you felt the aftermath of the fight. The Chancellor might be really strong, but there's no way that she came out unharmed from that fight. It probably wasn't anything major, but it might still take some time. Aoife lowered her head and contemplated Evelyn's words. To some extent, her words made sense. Looking up and fixing her gaze on the boring Kira, she prepared to speak when Kira raised her hand to stop her. Evelyn is most likely right. Question mark quote. A question mark appeared over Aoife's head. Why did she stop her from speaking? Aoife got her answer not long after. Your voice is not pleasing to the ear. I'd rather you keep quiet. Question mark quote. Wait, wasn't Kira supposed to be nice? Why, there's a limit to how nice I can be. Question mark quote. The hell? In any case, we should probably take this chance to explore the city. Since we might have to go back to the Empire soon, why not explore the city and buy some items that you can only find here? Like, as Aoife asked, Kira pointed towards the distance where merchants lined up. Get your bones. We provide the best bones. Terror rank bones included. Bones. Aoife's eyes widened with realization as she looked around her to see several cadets salivating while staring in the distance. Indeed, bones were quite hard to find in the Empire. While she never had a shortage of bones due to her family providing her with any bone that she wanted, the same couldn't be said for the others. This place. It was, without a doubt, a gold mine for the cadets here. You make a good point. Aoife nodded quietly, turning her attention towards the right, where she saw a pensive-looking figure. He was standing with his head lowered, deep in contemplation. Was something up? Aoife raised her brow and approached Leon, brushing her red hair behind her ear. Is everything good? Hearing Aoife's voice, Leon turned his head. Spotting Aoife, he opened his mouth to say something, but decided against it and just simply nodded while mumbling, I'm fine. Are you? Leon's face said otherwise. He looked anything but fine. However, Aoife didn't press him. She knew that pressing would only annoy him. In the end, she pointed towards the stall in the distance. Why don't you consider buying some bones? As far as I know, you still have quite a few slots that you can fill. Turning his head to stare at the distant stalls, Leon scratched his cheek as his eyes narrowed a little. Looking at the numerous bones that were put on display, and feeling the aura of a few, he felt somewhat tempted. He indeed was lacking in bones. It wasn't like he lacked the money to purchase them, but the prices in the Empire were really too absurd. Buying one bone needed deep and careful consideration. It wasn't like he could buy as many as he wished, after all. However, staring at the prices of the bones here, Leon realized that most of the bones here were almost 4 to 5 times cheaper than in the Empire. This was practically a steal, and after musing for a few more moments, he decided to head for one of the stalls. While his thoughts had been preoccupied with Julian and how to find him, he at least knew that he was safe. He could spare some time looking for some bones. Bones. We offer the lowest prices. Get your bone. Stalls lined both sides of the long cobblestone street, with people meandering from one to the next. Some merchants drew steady crowds, their goods in high demand, while others stood idly by, waiting as fewer customers came their way. One quick look at Leon was able to understand why. Hellfish, Terror rank bone, 900,000 solas. Hellfish, Terror rank bone, 770,000 solas. Some stores simply sold at a cheaper price than others. Wow, that's a massive difference. The cadets couldn't help but marvel at the sight, feeling tempted to purchase the bones straight away. If they could bring some back. It's good and all, but can we even afford them? At Aoife's sudden question, the faces of a few changed. Evelyn patted her pockets, taking out a sack and peeking at the gap, her face changing slightly as she looked at the others. I might need to start selling a few things before I can afford it. Same. Me too. Everyone quickly realized the problem that they were currently facing. While the bones were indeed a lot cheaper than in the Empire, the currency here was different. None of them had the amount required by the merchants in order to purchase the bones. Do you think we can trade? Maybe. Looking at them, Leon's eyes narrowed slightly. He was a bit different from them. He actually did have the money to buy at least one bone. A terror rank 1. However, was this what he really wanted? Considering how I haven't filled all my bones yet, a terror rank might be good. But, what about a destroyer rank? Leon felt that absorbing a terror rank bone was a bit of a waste when he could consume a destroyer rank 1. However, at the same time, he also knew that the rank wasn't exactly the most crucial thing when selecting a bone. The most important thing was the skill that came with the bone. An infant rank bone could very well provide him with a skill that was far more useful than a destroyer rank 1. But in terms of raw power, the destroyer rank 1 was without a doubt going to be a lot better. It was a tough decision. One that left Leon stumped. Then again, finding a destroyer rank bone isn't going to be easy. It'll also probably cost a lot. There's no point in getting too greedy. Leon shook his head, ready to give up on his search, when suddenly, a voice echoed through the air. Get your bones from us. We from the Grey Chamber provide the lowest prices. You won't be disappointed. We also offer destroyer-ranked bones. Come before they're gone. Leon's head snapped toward the voice, though it was quickly swallowed by the chatter of merchants all around. A destroyer-ranked bone. He wasn't the only one who heard the voice, as Aoife, Kira, Kalian, Keys, Amael, and Evelyn also heard it. Immediately, their interest was piqued as they all turned to look at each other before moving towards the distant stall where a fairly young man appeared. He appeared rather skinny, with his strength hovering around the 4th to 5th tier. He wasn't exactly strong, but turning their attention towards the woman standing next to him, they all grew incredibly serious. While they weren't sure of her strength, just one look at her was enough to make them all extremely apprehensive. She's strong. Though a wave of apprehension passed over them, it was tempered by a sense of relief. If it were her, they feared being scammed less. She clearly had the strength to gather destroyer-ranked bones. Leon and the others prepared to approach the stall. However, right as they did so, they were suddenly startled to see her frowning, alongside the skinny vendor, as they both looked towards a man who was covering his face with both hands, his body trembling. What's going on? He looked to be crying. Was everything all right? No, but most importantly, why does he feel familiar? Leon's lips pressed together. For whatever reason, staring at the distant merchant, Leon felt a sense of familiarity coming from him, and without knowing, he started moving on his own, reaching the stall as he suddenly asked. I saw that you were selling bones. If now is not a good time, then. The moment he spoke, the merchant suddenly seemed to freeze while the other two turned their heads in his direction, both sporting a smile. Ah, we have a customer. Are you looking for a bone? For some reason, the two of them looked rather enthusiastic as they looked at him. When Leon turned his attention towards the other merchant, his brow rose as the merchant turned his back against him and squatted down towards a box filled with bones, picking one slowly before blowing on it. Anaz and Anne both looked at the merchant, and just barely managed to keep their smiles from twitching. The hell was he doing? No, now wasn't the time. He quickly forced a smile. We offer all sorts of bones. From infant to destroyer. You can tell us what sort of requirement you need, and we can work to find the bone that best suits your needs. As Anaz spoke, he fixed his gaze on the man before him. Short black hair framed a face marked by striking gray eyes. He wasn't handsome, nor was he ugly. He was simply average, yet, a single glance revealed undeniable strength beneath the ordinary exterior. Anne also saw this, which was why the two of them were enthusiastic. If he were strong, it meant that he had money. They needed money. Not only that, but looking behind the man, they also saw several other people, all looking around in wonder. They didn't seem to lose out to the man in front of them, and their eyes glinted. However, what they weren't aware of was the fact that Leon continued to keep his gaze on the strange man. No matter how I look at it, he feels familiar. But looking at his waist and seeing a sword, Leon's brows furrowed. He slowly started to recall some pieces of information he had heard in the past, and his eyes narrowed even further. It couldn't be, right? Customer. While his instincts currently didn't work, Leon felt the resemblance become clearer and clearer as the seconds passed. It couldn't be him, right? His body shook for a brief moment. Customer. But if it was him, why didn't he turn around? Surely he recognized him. Unless, he's ignoring me. But why would he do that? No, taking into consideration how he had left without a word, Leon was sure that he had his own reasons. In that sense, would calling out for him now not be something he'd wish for? Leon fell into deep contemplation. Customer. But that contemplation only lasted a few seconds before he was suddenly jolted by a loud voice as his head flicked towards the merchants, who were both looking at him with worried expressions. Is everything okay? Have you found the bone that you wish? They both looked at him with a look of anticipation, waiting for him to give his requirements. And soon, Leon's mouth opened. But, what do you call a fly without wings? Huh. Both Anaz and Anne froze, their minds growing blank. And just before they could process the situation, Leon continued. Quote. A walk. Quote. 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 Lines formed across the faces of everyone present, including Leon, whose face seemed to turn as stoic as a rock. Chapter 687. It's been a while. 7. Quote. Quote. Amid the general noise of merchants and bargaining customers, a distinct silence hung over one particular stall. Quote. Quote. As if everyone was possessed, they all wore the same stoic faces, gazes directed towards a certain individual whose face looked even more deadpan. Right now, Leon was dying inside, his stomach was twisting, and he was just one moment away from puking. However, he held the disgust in as he looked towards his target. With his back turned towards him, Leon wasn't able to see his face. But that didn't matter to him. If it were the same guy that he knew, then it wouldn't matter. But, nothing. He remained focused on the task at hand. Did he assume wrongly? Question marks appeared on Leon's head. What the fuck was that? The silence surrounding them was finally broken by a sharp voice, drawing every eye to the speaker, who fixed Leon with a look that radiated pure disgust. Just as she was about to follow up with her words, a voice chimed in. Wait, did, boring Kira, just swear? Am I hearing things? She did. Several nods followed after, everyone looking at Kira with both surprise and relief. Seeing Kira not swear felt odd to them. This felt a lot better to them. The frown on Kira's face deepened when she heard their words, and just as she opened her mouth, she closed it as her fists clenched tightly. Aoife quickly moved next to Evelyn as she mumbled, "She's going to slap me, isn't she? I can feel it. She's really about to slap me. She is. Evelyn nodded by the side, adding fuel to the fire. The two were clearly teasing Kira, and they were doing a very good job at it, as Kira was starting to lose control of herself. However, taking several deep breaths, she managed to calm herself down as she lowered her fist and closed her eyes. Calm. I need to remain calm. She had been doing such a good job as of late to be more mature and not get triggered easily. Tisk. Her brow twitched when she heard the sound of tongues clicking, however, she remained firm and resolute. Staring at the sight, Leon felt that this scene was a lot more in line with how things used to be in the past. For some reason, it made him feel a little more relaxed as he turned his attention back towards the merchant. His doubts only rose when he saw him blow on another bone. Customer. Getting called again, Leon turned towards the woman merchant as she forced a smile. Did you find anything that you wish to buy? Feel free to tell us if you found anything. Anaz forced a smile as he stood next to her. He had been somewhat taken aback by the joke, but it was just a joke. It was weird, but nothing bad. He might not be right in the head, but so long as he pays, it doesn't matter. The joke was quite frankly terrible, too. He couldn't think of one person who would even find that remotely funny. Oh, yes. Looking at the merchants with an apologetic look, Leon shifted his attention towards the manual in front of him as he scrolled through it before picking a random terror-ranked bone. Honestly, he wasn't even paying attention to the bone he was picking. He was more preoccupied with other things. I'd like to see this one, please. This one. Anaz looked at the bone that Leon picked and raised his brow. Crown whale. I see. Not a bad choice. Nodding, Anaz shifted his gaze to Lazarus, who raised his hand to reveal a black bone. A powerful pressure radiated from it, sweeping through the surroundings. Thanks. Nodding his head, Anaz reached for the bone. However, right as he did, Leon opened his mouth again. Why did the whale blush? Quote. The faces of several people changed at once as they all snapped their heads in Leon's direction. It saw the ocean's bottom. Quote. I once read a book about glue. Quote. I couldn't put it down. The silence that had once filled the surroundings once again returned. This time, it was even more pronounced than before as the faces of everyone present turned stoic, their eyes fixed on Leon, who looked just as stoic. But upon closer look, one would see that there was no light in his eyes. He had the face of someone who had given up on their pride and shame. How did the barber win the race? He knew a shortcut. Quote. Quote ellipsis dot quote. By now, it wasn't just the cadets and Anne and Anaz who were quiet. As if the other customers and merchants had heard Leon's words, they too stopped, their faces turning stoic as they all looked at Leon, who looked completely unfazed, his sense of shame thrown towards the furthest place possible. The entire time he said the jokes, he kept his gaze fixed on the merchant who was continuously moving the bones, seemingly unbothered by them. Leon's frown deepened when he saw no reaction from him, and it was also then that he was suddenly reminded of something. Is my delivery not good? Indeed, that could be the problem. It was just unfortunate that everyone heard his words as Anas's face turned extremely strange. Delivery? What delivery? The jokes were horrible to begin with. What would the delivery do? Anaz felt like crying. Why did it seem like he was only meeting strange people lately? First, it was the merchant. Then it was the pirate woman. And now, this random stranger was fixated on jokes. As if anyone would kook. Anaz paused for a moment, his eyes blinking slowly as he turned his attention behind him, where he saw Lazarus diligently working on cleaning up the bones in front of him. His brows furrowed even more. I could have sworn that I heard the sound coming from here, am I overthinking? Yes, that might be the case. Anaz was prepared to turn around when Leon opened his mouth again. What do you call it when a cow grows facial hair? Leon's eyes narrowed as he looked at his target. Then, following a brief moment of silence, he said, a moustache. Quote ellipsis dot quote. Quote ellipsis dot quote. The silence felt loud, but within the silence, Leon heard another sound. Yook. The faces of many changed. Leon's face started to change as his eyes narrowed further, and he started to whisper. I've been learning a lot of jokes as of late. A certain someone did give me a book filled with such jokes in the past. Leon's face looked anything but normal. Taking a look at him, Anaz was taken aback. He looked like someone who had been wronged by the world as he fixed his gaze on Lazarus. Wait, Lazarus. Turning around, Anaz was shocked to see Lazarus's body trembling. I have also improved massively on my delivery. I don't think there's anyone who is as good as me now. Lazarus's body trembled further, and Anas's expression turned even stranger. No way. It was just as things were about to escalate when Leon pressed his hand against the table and pointed towards a certain bone. I'll take this. What? Leon's sudden action caught everyone off guard. Was he schizophrenic? What was up with him today? While everyone was wondering the same thing, Anaz was quick to move, taking out the bone that Leon requested and handing it to him as Leon handed him a large sack of coins. Here, it was a pleasure dealing with you. And with that, Leon smiled and turned around, fiddling with the bone in his hand as he moved past the stupefied cadets. They all seemed to have a lot of things to say, but Leon just smiled at them. He had gotten what he wanted. He was also able to confirm what he wanted. That was all that Leon planned on doing. He had no plans on exposing Julian. Since he's keeping his identity a secret, it must be because he has to. I see no reason to expose him. All Leon wanted to do was confirm that he was alive and well. This was his duty as his knight. Now that he was certain, he could feel a lot more at ease. Hey, what is up with you? Did you hit your head or something? Ignoring everyone else as he walked away, Leon silently smiled. It's been a while. He definitely figured something out. Despite my best attempts, I had blown my cover. This bastard. His delivery wasn't even good. At the very least, not as good as mine. The issue lay in the fact that his jokes were good. I had made a mistake in giving him the book back then. Thankfully, Leon didn't pursue the matter any longer and just left. He probably understood that I wasn't in a position to reveal my identity. Well, I wasn't so sure anymore. I knew that Cithras was most likely about to figure out the situation, and Leon was still the owner of the chalice. Realistically speaking, there was no longer a need for me to hide the fact that I was alive. It was just that I wasn't quite ready yet. At least, not ready to face her just yet. Honestly, I was scared. I knew that she knew that I was alive. I had purposely left some clues in order to get her to come. The idea was that she could help me in case I lost myself in Lazarus, but that thankfully didn't happen. In the end, she still did end up helping me by getting Zahir. I knew that things would eventually end up at this point. But how in the world is she going to react? All sorts of thoughts swirled in my mind at that moment as I struggled to think properly. But soon, my thoughts were broken by a certain voice. We've struck it quite rich. It was Anaz. He was currently waving the money pouch. Looking at him, I forced a smile. Nice, with this, we will be able to pay off the damage. Yeah, it's way more than enough. Anaz looked genuinely happy, but at the same the smile wiped away from his face as he turned in the direction of where Leon had been. That said, I've never encountered anyone as weird as that guy. What was up with him and his weird joke? Yeah, Anne nodded alongside him, but, well, they were good jokes. Quite good in fact, enough to make me envious. Quote ellipsis dot quote, quote ellipsis dot quote. Annis's and Anne's bodies froze, their faces turning stoic at the same time. For a moment, I almost thought I saw lines tracing down the sides of their faces. Almost like half of their faces were covered by a shadow. Strange. The jokes were good, though. Chapter 688. I guess so. 1. I'm rather surprised by the amount that we've managed to make. I didn't expect people to actually buy from us. Counting the numerous sacks in front of him, Annis's eyes shone. I was also staring at the money with the same look. Following Lowen's appearance, we managed to acquire our fair number of customers. That isn't surprising if you think about it. Anne suddenly spoke, staring at the coins in front of us as her eyes squinted a little. Reaching forward, she tossed one of the sacks in the air to feel their weight before putting them back down on the table as Anaz turned his attention towards her. What do you mean? I mean what I mean. Anne picked up another sack and looked through it. Following the recent event with the gigantic monster in the city, most people are likely scared and worried. You of all people know what most people do when they're scared. That is. Anaz looked at her cluelessly. I was similarly lost, but after a little bit of thought, it struck me as I opened my mouth to answer. They try to get stronger. Yes. With a simple nod, Anne put the sack down. Since you never know if an incident similar to this one might happen again, everyone is purchasing bones in order to become stronger. This is, after all, the fastest and most effective way to become stronger. You can say that the demand for bones has shot through the roof. Ah, Anaz finally appeared to understand as he slapped his fist against his open palm. That makes sense. I guess that kind of explains why the place is so busy. That's not all. Anne turned her attention towards the numerous bones that we had. Our prices are also relatively lower than most other vendors. It's no surprise that we managed to sell so much. Right, she wasn't wrong here either. Our prices were indeed a lot lower than most of the other vendors. It was both good and bad. It was bad in the sense that most vendors here had some sort of agreement with each other in order to keep the prices consistent, and with us selling it at a lower value, it made their entire agreement go up in smoke. Good in the sense that we were able to make a lot of money. Either way, with Anne present, none of the vendors were even able to do a single thing besides glare in our direction. So what if they were annoyed? Anne would slap them out of this place if they so much as said something. No wonder. I thought I was going crazy when I felt the numerous glares around me. Anaz appeared to have had another understanding. I felt a little sorry for him. Of the three of us, he had probably been the one who had worked the most. He didn't really get the chance to think about these matters. Whatever the case is, we've managed to get what we wanted. I think it's time we close up shop and go back. Looking around and seeing the crowd slowly starting to thin out, I knew that it was time for us to end the sale. While we still had quite a lot of bones to sell, we were no longer in need of money. The bones would just go back to Anne, who could sell them on her own. Turning around and staring at them, I squatted down before separating the bones in terms of rank. It was the least I could do. Yawning, Anaz also appeared to agree as he turned around and prepared to clean up. However, right as he did, a shadow cast over us as Anaz raised his head to speak. Sorry, but we're. However, halfway through his words, he appeared to stop. A strange silence filled the surroundings as I raised my brow. Why did it suddenly go silent? What's going on? Confused, I turned around to see what was happening, but the moment I did, my entire body froze, rooted in place as I felt my heart and breath stop. A pair of obsidian eyes, ones I was so familiar with, locked onto me, and in that instant, I stood frozen. My mind went blank, thoughts scattered like ash in the wind, as the world around me seemed to halt in eerie, suspended silence. She just stared at me. No words, no expressions. She just stared, and yet, her stare seemed to say a million words as I struggled to think properly. Why oh you're that woman from before. It was Annis's voice that snapped me out of my state as he stared at Delilah with wide eyes. Judging from his expression, he appeared to recognize her as his expression looked incredibly tense. Thinking about it, he was with me when she appeared back then. The same was for Anne, who took a step back, her entire body tense. And yet, despite their actions, Delilah didn't move at all. She just kept her gaze fixed on me. Feeling her gaze, I opened my mouth again, trying to get words out. But nothing really came out. Regardless of how hard I tried, I couldn't muster a single word. Why was this so hard? It felt as though her gaze weighed down on me like some sort of boulder that was the size of an entire planet. It kept me rooted in place, preventing me from moving at all. The only thing I could do was scratch the side of my face nervously. In the end, it was Anis's voice that prompted me to lift my head. "What is going on? Did he offend you?" I paused. Hearing Anis's words, I stared in his direction, and found myself at a complete loss. Was this really the first thing that he thought when he saw her staring at me like that? Was I that unreliable? Well, moving my head to stare in Delilah's direction, and meeting her gaze once more, my lips parted as I finally seemed to find my voice again. With a complicated look, I nodded subtly. I guess you could say that. Thinking about everything that she had gone through because of me, and her current expression, it was safe to say that she was anything but pleased with me. Oh God. Anis's face went ghostly pale the moment my words left my mouth. Anne mirrored his reaction, both of them staring at me with a mix of horror and barely contained anger. Their expressions seemed to say, "Why would you provoke her? We're going to die because of you." They really didn't seem to be happy with me. However, I was at a point where I could no longer care about them as I felt Delilah's gaze become even more piercing as my head unconsciously lowered. "I'm sorry." Words started to flow out of my mouth as I stared at the table beneath. I had my circumstances. Honestly, I didn't even know what I was saying. I wanted to say it, but I couldn't. I'm sorry for the thing I did before. It was a misunderstanding. I was also joking. I didn't mean to come off like that. I was just rambling at this point. Was I making excuses, or explaining myself? I didn't know. I just felt like I needed to say everything. I know it's my fault, and you are probably very angry at me. Maybe you won't even forgive me for what I did, but, okay. Bang! A sudden, invisible force slammed into my chest, hurling me backward. I crashed hard against the wall, the impact knocking the air from my lungs, before collapsing onto the jagged pile of bones beneath me. Lazarus. Shit. Both Anaz and Anne looked in my direction in shock, ready to move to me, but stopped right as I raised my hand. "I'm okay." I sat stunned for a moment, my thoughts frozen as I held onto my chest. It didn't hurt. In fact, no part of my body hurt. She had clearly held back a lot, but slowly lifting my head and staring at her face, I suddenly felt like I had been hit by a truck. Although subtle, I saw it. I saw the faint tremble in her lips. This was when I understood. This wasn't the answer that she wanted. She wasn't here for the excuses. She wasn't here for an apology either. I'm fine. Eventually nodding my head, I leaned my head back against the wall. "I'm doing okay." I desperately wanted to say those words, but the moment I tried, I found something blocking my mouth. I tried again, but "I'm doing fine." Yet again, I struggled to get the words out. As if something was preventing me from saying them, I found myself unable to utter them at all. Why couldn't I say them? Slowly lifting my head to stare at Delilah and meeting her gaze, I opened my mouth to once again say the words, but as I did, I noticed something. My lips. Why were they trembling? Shit. I closed my eyes, feeling a sudden urge to laugh. I was an emotive mage. One of the best in the entire world. I was a person capable of manipulating the emotions of a person to the point where they could lose sight of themselves. I was also more knowledgeable about emotions than most people. I was a being that was supposed to have utter control of his own emotions. Someone that shouldn't be easily influenced by them. And yet, are you okay, Lazarus? Why in the world was I struggling to keep my emotions in check? Why in the world was I incapable of stopping the pain that was grabbing at my chest? Why in the world was I unable to stop the anger from drawing up from inside my mind? Why in the world? It all paused the moment I turned to look at her gaze once more. She hadn't spoken a single word since the start. The entire time, she just looked at me. However, despite her silence, it felt as though she knew everything. As if I couldn't hide anything under her gaze, and the feeling made the pain that was invading my chest even more pronounced. In the end, lowering my head, I mumbled, "You win." I closed my eyes, leaning back against the wall as I mumbled, "I am not fine." Chapter 689. I guess so too. The moment the words came out of my mouth, It felt as though a massive boulder had been pressed against my chest. Was I fine? I never really thought about the question before. No, it was more like I never had the time to properly think about the question. There was simply no time for me to think about myself. I had to train. I had to look for Noelle. I had to go to the mirror dimension. I had to solve a situation. I had a lot of things to do. Be it in this world, and in my previous world. When was the last time that I properly took care of myself? I tried to think about it, but the more I tried, the more I came to realize that nothing really came to mind. Back on Earth, following my parents' death, my life simply revolved around Noelle. All I could think about was how to make sure that Noelle lived a good life. Education, health, diet, everything. I took all sorts of jobs and did things that I didn't want to do in order to fill in for my parents' jobs. In that time, I never took care of myself. And that was probably what caused my death. Or at least, that was how it was supposed to be. Now, I wasn't even so sure how I had actually died. Nonetheless, even as I arrived in this world, my life revolved around Noelle and getting back to him. In order to become stronger, I put myself through a lot of pain and suffering. I didn't mind the pain. I was used to the pain. And that was probably the first sign. In the end, be it past, present, or future, nothing really changed. I simply didn't care enough about myself. I tried, but didn't. But it wasn't like I could just go around and say that I wasn't okay. Who even did that? Sometimes, a few simple words can turn out to be the hardest thing someone could say. But what did it matter if I wasn't okay? What did it matter if I was struggling? At the end of the day, I didn't have the time to think about myself. And so, slowly lifting my head, I nodded in the silence, staring towards the pair of obsidian black eyes that stared squarely at me. Yes, I am not okay. But I will be fine. Because I had to be. Quote. The silence that followed my words felt suffocating. And yet, I was unbothered by the silence as I stared straight into her eyes. Even now, she refused to say a single thing. She was just standing there, looking at me. Is she not going to say anything? Is she just going to stand there and stare at me? I'd rather she say something. Why isn't she saying anything? My thoughts started to spiral as I continued to feel her gaze. I was at a complete loss. Why was she not saying anything? Do you two know each other? It was right in that moment that a certain voice spoke, and I turned my head to see Anne staring in our direction with a weird expression. Anaz was also sporting a similar expression as they looked between the two of us. Well, I looked at Delilah before eventually nodding. Yes, you can say that. Quote. Although the two already seemed to have gotten an idea due to our conversation, the moment I confirmed it to them, their expressions changed quite a bit. However, it was also in that moment that I found Delilah's attention turning towards them, and a sudden chill swept through the air as she settled her gaze over to them. Or more specifically, Anne. Why is she looking at her like that? For some reason, the atmosphere felt cold. I wasn't the only one who felt this way, as Anne looked like she was experiencing all sorts of things. Seeing the two of them, I was left momentarily confused. Does she hold a grudge against Anne? Why? Wait. However, before I could figure out the reason for Delilah's sudden change in attitude, I saw Anne raise both of her hands as she looked at Delilah. She then turned her attention towards me. Quote. I think I understand what is going on. She did. Looking at her, and noticing the subtle trembling of her body, I saw her suddenly glare at me as I cocked my head in confusion. What sort of? I have someone that I like. Quote. Question marks popped on top of my head, and Annis's. It was clear that we were both confused. She had someone she liked. Well, maybe. We didn't really bother asking her. It wouldn't be strange if that were the case. But what did that have to do with the situation? It's this guy. Anne placed her hand on top of Annis's head, and the atmosphere froze. Quote. The question marks multiplied, and Annis's face seemed to lose all sorts of pigmentation. At the same time, Anne looked my way. I have no interest in the merchant. The circumstances back then were because of his skill. I blinked my eyes, my mind churning as I dug through Lazarus's memories. It was also then that my eyes slowly started to widen as realization dawned on me. Oh, Shit, my heart sank as I looked at Delilah, whose single point of focus was Anne and the frozen Anaz. In the end, she still didn't say anything as she just stared at the two of them. For whatever reason, her mouth didn't appear to be working today. And yet, just her gaze alone was enough to make us understand what she meant as Anne started trembling further. I could see from the expression she was making that she was screaming things like, "You believe me, right? I really don't have anything to do with this. Please believe me." However, even as a few seconds passed, nothing happened as Delilah remained rooted where she was, her gaze hovering over Anne. In the end, clenching her teeth, Anne pulled Annis's head back and brought her head down, smacking her lips against his. Quote. Color quickly returned to Annis's face as his eyes shot open. I stared in shock, eyes wide and lips parted, barely able to process what I was witnessing. It felt unreal, like my mind refused to accept it. As the agonizing seconds crawled by, Anne finally pulled her head back and released Anaz. His body crumpled to the floor, limp and lifeless, like a puppet with its strings severed. Thud, lying on the floor, he opened and closed his mouth repeatedly. Like a fish that was out of the water. I wanted to react the same way, but as I slowly pulled my head up, I saw Anne slowly wipe her mouth as she looked at Delilah. "See, the two of us really love each other." Her face was incredibly red as she spoke. Quote. Delilah stared at Anne for a few good moments before pulling her head away and turning her attention back towards me. I could only force a smile. I've seen them do this a lot. Annis's body twitched on the ground. He probably heard me, but was too stunned to even do anything. Not that he could even if he wanted to. I do love him a lot, haha. Anne scratched the back of her head as she looked at me, her expression containing all sorts of emotions. Mostly, she looked like she was still scared shitless. I couldn't blame her. I was just as scared of her. Quote. In silence, Delilah's gaze slowly hovered towards Anaz and then Anne again. I stared at her in stunned silence for a long moment, until, without warning, she turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes locked onto mine as she pressed a hand gently over her lips, then slowly pursed them. Quote. My nose twitched for a brief moment, feeling her actions were a little weird. But then, as if she had had enough, Delilah slowly turned away and started to move into the crowd behind her. I wanted to reach out to her but felt that it would lead to nothing. In the end, staring at her retreating figure, I slumped down on the chair behind me as I wiped the cold sweat that had accumulated on my forehead. Fuck, why do I feel way more tired than when I fought against Zahir? While it was technically Lazarus who fought, the mental toll and exhaustion were still on me. I felt way more drained by her mere presence than the fight I recently had, and as I took a couple of breaths, I felt a pair of emerald eyes stare directly at me. It was Anne. Before I knew it, she was now standing in front of me, her face hovering right before me as she looked back toward Delilah's retreating figure. What's your relationship with her? No, Anne shook her head, mumbling things like, it's obvious enough the relationship is not normal. There's no way she would have reacted like that otherwise. Quote. In the end, looking at me, she asked, was that your companion? What? I frowned, looking at her. Companion? What sort of nonsense was this? While it was true that I liked her, our relationship was quite complicated. In fact, as of right now, that was probably the furthest thing from the truth. I wasn't even sure if she was fine with me. In fact, she might even hate me. The fact that she didn't say anything the entire time was proof of this, and just as I was about to answer, I raised my head to stare at the distant figure, who, for some reason, appeared to pause. She was listening, wasn't she? In that case, she probably wanted to know my answer too. I clenched my teeth, staring at her back, and then Anne. I leaned back on the chair and muttered. I guess so. By the time I looked towards the distance again, she was gone. Chapter 690. I guess so 3. Moments leading up to the situation. What's going on? It all happened out of nowhere. It was right when they had just finished counting their money and were about to close up the stall. Right at that moment, a figure appeared before them. Just one look at her was enough to take Annis's breath away. He had never seen anyone so impossibly perfect. Her face was delicately sculpted, every feature refined to utter perfection. Her long, lustrous black hair cascaded down like silk, and her eyes, those eyes, were as deep and unfathomable as the abyss itself. But that wasn't all. Forgetting all about her appearance, Anaz became acutely aware of the identity of the person that stood before him, and his entire body froze on the spot. She She was the same person who had taken care of Zahir. Recalling the moments when she fought against the beast, and even managed to suppress it up to a certain point, Anas felt cold sweat trickling down the side of his face. Why in the world was she here? He didn't have to wait long to get his answer as he saw her look in Lazarus's direction. Shit, Anas was scared shitless. At first, he thought that Lazarus had in his own way offended her. Or even worse, she had somehow been swindled by him. If that were to be the case, then Anas was prepared to immediately make a run for it. While she was strong, Anas didn't believe for one second that with his skill, Lazarus wouldn't be able to swindle her. He was that much of a swindler. But then, he was quick to realize that something was amiss with the situation. Alternating his gaze between the two, he immediately understood that his previous assumption was different. The two of them, they know each other. He tried to dismiss the thought at first, but staring at the two, Anas felt more and more sure of his assumption until he heard Lazarus's words. As if some sort of cold water had been poured onto his mind, Anas stood rooted on the spot as his eyes slowly started to widen. He really knows her. He wasn't the only one shocked. Anne also seemed equally shocked as they stared at each other. Anas had always been wondering about Lazarus's real identity. He had always been aware of the fact that it wasn't his real identity, and that he had some sort of hidden background. How else would he be able to provide such goods? However, never in his wildest dreams did Anas think that Lazarus's background was like this. If the woman was truly on his side, then Lazarus must have been from some sort of major organization. At least, this was what Anas thought at first. However, looking closer at the two of them, Anas felt that something was amiss between the two. The air between them, it was rather cold. Maybe they aren't on good terms. He silently licked his lips while turning his attention towards Anne, who stared at the two with a frown. She seemed to be sharing different thoughts from his. However, even under Anas's pleading gaze, she didn't answer. Though the black-haired woman, whose very presence seemed to eclipse everything around her, carried an aura of absolute coldness, Anne could see it clearly. There was nothing cold in the way she looked at Lazarus. Her gaze, as intense as it was, held something far more complex, something closer to affection. Yes, I don't believe they are on bad terms. Anne whispered silently to Anas, causing him to be confused. Anne could see at a glance that the story between Lazarus and the woman was complicated. In fact, she could tell that there was a certain something within the relationship as her lips pursed together. A thought struck her in that moment. That would explain his weird actions and connections. If the two of them knew each other, then Lazarus's mysterious background could finally be explained. Or at least, to some extent. Anne was still unaware of the woman's background. However, at a glance, she could tell that she wasn't from these areas. Someone as powerful as her was sure to have made a name for herself. The real question was, what sort of relationship did she and Lazarus have? Anne didn't have to wait long to get her answer as she suddenly felt the woman's icy gaze on her. At first, she was confused, shocked, and even scared, but then, seeing her subtly look at Lazarus as she looked at her with that gaze, realization quickly struck Anne as she quickly got to work and tried to clear up whatever misunderstanding existed. Thud, even as Anas fell to the floor, at a complete loss, with his eyes swirling around, Anne remained tense as she looked at the woman. It was only a guess, and she wasn't sure if it was going to work, but the moment she let go of Anas, it felt as though she felt subtle hints of relief in the woman's cold and indifferent face as she touched her lips. In the end, she never once spoke a word, leaving as fast as she came. It was only after the woman had walked far enough away that Anne finally turned to Lazarus, her voice low as she asked about his relationship with her. But the moment he replied with a hesitant, "I guess," Anne felt the ground shift beneath her, like the entire world had suddenly turned upside down. Even Anas couldn't help but snap out of whatever state he was in as he looked at Lazarus, with a complicated expression. In the end, the reason why you posed yourself as a merchant is because of some domestic dispute with your girlfriend. Quote ellipsis. Julian's face twitched for a brief moment. His usually composed expression showed signs of cracking as his lips twitched. He wanted to argue, but found that he couldn't. He eventually shook his head. It's not that simple, but it's not like it doesn't exist. Well, so it does. Julian looked at Anas for a short moment before lowering his head. He seemed to have given up on arguing, which wasn't far from the truth. In his mind, the previous scene replayed in his mind over and over again as he pursed his lips together, trying his best to keep himself composed. In the end, did anything change? He was extremely confused. The entire time, Delilah hadn't said a single word. Did she forgive him? Did she hate him? What was going to happen? Julian's thoughts swirled in all sorts of directions as he struggled to grasp what Delilah's intentions were. However, it was in the midst of his confusion that he felt his chest throb, and when he looked down in the direction of the pain, he was surprised to see something within his breast pocket. What? Confused, Julian reached out for his pocket, only to pull out a warm piece of paper. His eyes widened, slightly. When in the world? No, wait. It must have been during the time when she smacked me back. Realization quickly dawned on him as he opened the paper and read the message. We will be leaving in 2 days. That was all the message said. It had no location, no exact time. It just, read that. Julian covered his forehead. What am I supposed to do with this piece of information? Was she telling him to come with them? Or was she just telling him that they were going to leave then? Julian was an even greater loss than he was before. In the end, the only thing he could do was sigh while blankly staring at the gray sky above. All sorts of thoughts crossed his mind in that moment, but eventually, with a sigh, his expression relaxed. Thinking about it, I don't have any more reason to stay in this place anymore. I've achieved everything that I wanted to achieve. I think it's time that I leave. Lifting his head, Julian stared in the direction of Anaz and Anne, and his gaze flickered for a brief moment. It was also time for him to say goodbye. A lone figure moved serenely through the crowd that filled the cobblestone streets. Like a passing breeze, her presence went unnoticed, her black hair drifting softly with every step that she took. The world appeared to have completely lost her presence. Whenever someone approached, they instinctively stepped aside, completely unaware of her presence, as if guided by something invisible. All the while, she stood still, calmly surveying her surroundings as the world around her moved. She took in the scene before her. From the numerous stalls to the people who haggled by the stalls. None of it escaped her sight as she calmly observed everything. Eventually, however, her steps came to a stop as the people started to move around her. Staring at everything that was around her, Delilah's face fluctuated faintly. Her thoughts drifted towards a certain man. He looked different than he did in the past. From his facial structure to appearance, he was almost unrecognizable. However, she distinctly remembered seeing him in the past. It was during the time when the head of the Evanis household came to visit the academy. He was there all along. Delilah's emotions were complicated as her thoughts paused there. However, that didn't last for long as her mind soon drifted towards the events from a moment prior. She may not have been able to tell then, but she was able to tell now. Even though he looked different, he acted the same. From his flustered expression, to the way he sometimes hesitated to look at her, to the times he would scratch the side of his face. It was him, Delilah was certain, and in all honesty, she wanted to say something to him. She had never planned to stay quiet, but seeing his flustered expression, Delilah couldn't help but maintain her expression. That seemed to make him even more flustered as he tried to explain himself. He started rambling about a lot of things, and Delilah could see that if she didn't do anything, he wouldn't stop. So she did. He looked even more flustered. And, that look, Delilah couldn't help but feel amused by it. In the end, however, she knew that things wouldn't progress much from that point. That was why she left. Now, standing in the middle of the crowd, Delilah slowly brought her hand to her lips as a certain conversation flowed in her mind. Was that your companion? I guess so. Unconsciously, her lips slowly curled up as her figure faded from within the crowd. His words, not hers.